who has given many talks to the Society before over the years, was a founding member of the Society back in the 90s and the senior editor of the journal for its first 10 years of existence until 2016. So Philip is normally, or was normally, I should say, a specialist of the later period, at least later from my perspective as a 17th century historian, did his PhD on the French court in between the revolutionary eras, so roughly 1789 into the 1830s. And then that produced the first series of books, The French Court in the Revolutionary Era, and the biography of Louis XVIII, which has been translated into other languages and reissued, and is still really the model for biography of Louis XVIII. Philip has a completely separate strand, which is really interesting, I think, as a historian, to be a specialist as well of Istanbul, Constantinople, the Ottoman Empire, the Levant, most recently writing a book about Aleppo in 2016. And so with those two strands in mind, he really does cover, or should write a book about, let me throw that out, Franco-Ottoman Empire relationships. Maybe that's in the works. But more recently, Philip has turned his attentions a bit backward in time and has written a prize-winning and very successful book about Louis XIV called King of the World. And it's been translated already into numbers of languages, so I think it's going to be the biography of note for some time to come. And so kind of, I guess, bouncing off of that book, he's now going to talk to us tonight about royal funerals, going from Louis XIV to Louis XVIII and covering the 18th century rituals, such a central ritual to dynastic historians, and really has been written a lot about, I think, by Habsburg scholars in Spain and Austria, a lot more than maybe for France. So it'll be really great to get more insights into how the funerals were organized and what they represented at the court of France. So with that, please, Philip, take it away.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you all for attending. And of course, we've all experienced the funeral of Elizabeth II, so we know the impact of a royal funeral, and her funeral was probably more impressive and certainly more popular than Louis XIV. I'll be coming to that later. And I'm talking tonight about not only dynastic glory, but the politics of memory and the power of memory. And there's 2 points I want to make. First, that there was a huge dynastic fight back against the French Revolution after 1814, indeed before it, and that's what makes French royal funerals so interesting, I think, in this period. And second, there's no decay in royal funerals after the revolution. I would say that royal funerals had a golden, or perhaps I should say a deep black age in the 19th century. In no way did monarchy, even in France, become less splendid or less popular after the revolution, as the funerals will show. And just as an aside, I'd like to tell you all that in January 2023, there will be a series of commemorative masses, tours, and lectures in Chislehurst on the edge of London to mark another imperial funeral of the exiled Emperor Napoleon III 150 years ago in January 1873. To find out more, go to www.camden-place.com. Now, let us go to the funeral of Louis XIV. There was a tremendous tradition of French royal funerals, which he maintained after the move to Versailles. This is a picture by Van der Meulen, probably of the funeral procession of his wife, Marie-Thérèse, 1683. It is leaving Versailles and going to Saint-Denis the traditional necropolis of the French monarchy since before the Capetians, in fact, since the Merovingians, since the 6th century. And a very impressive necropolis it is indeed. There is her funeral procession. Here is a funeral procession of the Dauphin, the second Dauphin of Louis XIV's reign, his grandson, the Duke of Burgundy, which went through Paris, unlike Louis XIV's, in 1712. And here is the funeral procession of Louis XIV himself. It was very grand. All the carriages of Paris, it was said, watched the funeral cortege, September 1715, the 9th of September, going past the Bois de Boulogne on its way from Versailles to Paris. It doesn't go into Paris, possibly because of the king's unpopularity. And for 6 weeks, the king lay in state in the Abbey of Saint-Denis, in the presence of representatives of the institutions of church and state. "The king is dead, let us pray for the peace of his soul," said the King of Arms of France, as court officials broke their wands of office and threw them onto his coffin in its vault, as we saw a very minor version of that ceremony at the funeral of Elizabeth II. Then, as trumpets and drums sounded, the heralds proclaimed, "Vive le roi Louis XV du Nom, by the grace of God, King of France and Navarre, very Christian, very august, very powerful, our most honored Lord and good master, to whom God give very long and very fortunate life." And there were memorial services, not just at Saint-Denis, but in Paris, throughout France, throughout the other Bourbon monarchy, Spain, in Lima, in Mexico City, and at French missions abroad, in London, in Aleppo, and even in the hostile capital of Vienna. And the king was compared to King David, King Solomon, Augustus. At his funeral sermon at Saint-Denis on the 23rd of October, the Bishop of Castres asserted he almost never undertook any enterprise which did not succeed, and his misfortunes themselves only served to heighten his glory. And his reign was superior, the bishop added, to England's, and I quote, "badly understood liberty, unending source of discord. Even in dying, Louis is superior to other men." However, political reality obtruded. The king had not won all his wars. He'd left the kingdom on the edge of bankruptcy. And I quote from several different accounts, beginning with Voltaire's, as this funeral procession in this print proceeded on all sides, and I quote, along the route from Versailles to Saint-Denis, which is quite a long way, people had been drinking, laughing, singing, and playing music. A resentment of his wars and taxes and oppression was rampant. Even the master of ceremonies, in a semi-official diary, admitted that people regarded it as a fete or party, and full of joy at having seen the living king, did not feel all the sorrow which the death of such a great king should cause. A police official called Pierre Narbonne wrote in his diary, "Many people rejoiced at the death of this prince, and on all sides you could hear the sound of violins," particularly ironical since no king loved violins and music more than Louis XIV. So we begin at quite a low point from the point of view of the politics of royal funerals. Poems were produced saying, "Here in the same tomb lie the great Louis and the finances. Our invincible king died as he lived, without leaving us the quarter of an écu. In Saint-Denis, as at Versailles, he is without heart and without entrails." And that is referring to the French royal practice to separate the king's body, to put the heart in the church of Saint-Paul-Saint-Louis in the Marais, which you can still visit today, and the entrails in the great cathedral church of Notre Dame. That's one of the many funeral sermons printed in his honor. This is the statue of Louis XIV in Notre Dame, near where his entrails were placed. Because if your body is divided, more prayers in more different places can be said to heaven in your honor, therefore you're more likely to go to heaven. That is one explanation for this division of body parts, and also to increase the sanctity, like the relics of a saint. And this statue was not destroyed in the revolution, and he is offering the crown of France to the Virgin, as his father had done in 1638. He's repeating the gesture. And this is his heart as it was in the church of Saint-Paul-Saint-Louis, the main Jesuit church of Paris, in a golden container hanging near the high altar, but this was destroyed and, according to some accounts, devoured during the revolution. And as the 18th century proceeded, the splendor of royal funerals did not diminish. Here is a print by Cochin of the funeral of the first Dauphine at Saint-Denis in 1746, with a magnificent catafalque in the middle of the nave. And that is the funeral monument of the Dauphin, son of Louis XV, which was in the church of Sens, which is in the church of Sens. He died before his father. And Anne Byrne, a member of the society, who has written about the death of the kings of France, has shown that the funeral service of Louis XV, contrary to a legend, was just as magnificent as all others. His body, because he had died of smallpox, which was infectious, his body was rushed to Saint-Denis, straight from Versailles, but there was a magnificent funeral service in Saint-Denis. And in fact, again, politics obtrudes. It was used to show that the new Parliament, which Louis XV had installed in 1770 to 1771, was not really accepted by the political elite of France. The princes who attended the service barely acknowledged the presence of the Parliament at the service. The Parliament, a delegation would attend, because delegations of all senior institutions in the kingdom would attend the funeral. And soon after, the Parliament was in fact abolished. And I advise you all to read Anne Byrne's book, because it is a very subtle account of how the royal funerals of the kings of France were always political. And then the rock bottom for French royal funerals is, of course, the death of Louis XVI. Here he's shown in 21st of January 1793, his head being shown to the crowd. And his body was buried with other victims of the revolution quite near the Place de la Concorde, in a place we'll be seeing later on in this talk. And October 1793, this is a picture by Hubert Robert, a very interesting artist who'd specialized in ruins. And he used to go to Rome to paint ruins, but during the revolution, he could paint ruins in Paris because so many churches were destroyed or vandalized. And this actually shows the violation of the royal tombs in Saint-Denis in October 1793. And there is a detail. There is the body of Henri IV embalmed, exposed to the crowd, and about 50 kings and 40 queens and many princesses had their tombs violated. It was a huge operation of contempt and enmity. But the Bourbons returned, and part of their program, their really fairly unpopular and possibly counterproductive program of the restoration of the monarchy, was to restore the memory of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. And this is a drawing by Dugourc, a very interesting artist who was probably a royalist. He'd worked for the royal family before 1792 and after 1814. It shows the ceremonial translation of the bodies of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette from Paris, from the mass grave near the Place de la Concorde, from Paris to Saint-Denis. You see the great magnificence with which the ceremony was conducted, huge crowds. The Restoration monarchy is trying to say that Louis XVI was glorious and that he had been beloved, which of course was not the case. It was an extremely cold day, and many people said, I quote an English traveler who perhaps is not biased, he said, as many French people said, that the ceremony is disapproved of by the majority of Parisians. They think that it risks to light up again the memories of the past. Really, the Bourbons are looking back to the executed royal family. Most Parisians did not want to think about the reign of terror. On the other hand, the prefect of police wrote to Louis XVIII that a huge crowd surrounded the procession with its homage and its respect. A religious silence reigned on all sides as the convoy went past. And it was so cold that day that Marshal Ney thought of the retreat from Moscow. And it was mentioned as a point of criticism for the Bourbons. It was the first time another return to the past was visible. The revived units of the Maison Militaire du Roi, the Musketeers of the Guard, the Chevaux Légers of the Guard, and so on. And it wasn't just one funeral service. Every year until 1831, there would be a memorial service to Louis XVI on the day of his death, 21st of January, not just in Paris, but also in official churches throughout France, attended by local authorities. So it really was La France des larmes, as people said, and his will would be read out ceremonially during the church service. Here is the inside of Saint-Denis. You see the catafalque, you see the crowds in the Abbey Church, and sculptures by Courtauld of the king and the queen were erected in Saint-Denis. They're the last royal funeral sculptures in that church. Most of the tombs and sculptures have been destroyed in the Revolution, but you can still see those of Henri II and François Ier. By Pierre Petitot. And in addition, as if that was not enough, a chapel was built on the site of the mass grave of the victims of the Revolution. It's now beside Boulevard Haussmann, by Pierre Fontaine, the premier architecte du roi, at the private expense of the king, where the victims of the Revolution, particularly the Swiss guards who died defending the Tuileries, were buried. And inside the chapel, which is a very striking neoclassical work, you can see the, again, statues of the king and queen. This is Louis XVI rising to heaven, and below him in letters of gold are the words of his will, which preached forgiveness of enemies. And here there are scenes also by Fontaine showing his funeral procession. And this is Marie Antoinette, and below her are the words of her last letter to her sister, Madame Elizabeth, who is shown here on the right, representing religion. So religion with the features of Madame Elizabeth, like Cortot, is consoling Marie Antoinette. So you see, it's a really massive memorialization of the royal family. And that is a scene by Turpin de Crissey showing an average mass in the Chapelle Expiatoire in 1835, mostly attended by royalists. You can see how well dressed the congregation is. Because the moment the July Revolution took place, all official ceremonies in memory of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were stopped by his cousin, Louis Philippe. And 1817, this is a picture by Hayam, the remains that were buried in a mass grave of members of the royal family are disinterred in order that they can have, again, Christian burial inside. You see they're being received inside the church of Saint-Denis. So this is a very romantic scene by night. Again, it's trying to put the clock back and to reassert the royalty and sovereignty of the Bourbons. And it's not just the king and queen. When I started writing this talk, I hadn't realized the full extent of the sort of burying back undertaken by the Bourbons. This is a column marking the spot where the Duc d'Enghien, distant cousin of Louis XVI and Louis XVIII, the last of the House of Condé, was shot on the orders of Napoleon in 1804 in the moat surrounding the Chateau of Vincennes. This column was put up in 1816. But in addition, there it is again, that's where he was shot. He had been kidnapped from the territory of Baden on Napoleon's orders. In addition, there is a monument in the chapel of the Chateau of Vincennes to the Duc d'Enghien. He is on the left at the top with a figure representing the church holding his hand. On the bottom left is France in chains. Note the chains on the left. And on the right is a young man representing crime with a dagger. So again, there's no hiding of the what to the Bourbons were the disasters of the revolution. They are being commemorated. And in addition, other families made their own monuments, more modest monuments. This is the cemetery of Picpus, where people who'd been guillotined were buried, including Lafayette and his wife, because many of Lafayette's wife's relations of the Noailles family were guillotined. This is a monument in Lyon to the victims of the siege of Lyon in 1793, and this was destroyed in 1906 and replaced by a large church. A very large number of people died in the siege of Lyon and in the repression afterwards. And here you see a memorial to the dead, including their skulls. And a list of names of the victims of Lyon, who are commemorated by their descendants in Lyon to this day. And it's not just royalists are making a cult of the dead, of the victims of the revolution. The Duc d'Orléans, the future Louis Philippe, although his father had supported the revolution, he organizes a ceremonial reburial of all members of his family at Dreux, where there is a magnificent royal necropolis with statues to members of the House of Orleans. It was more than 170 kings, queens, princes, and abbés who were reburied at Saint-Denis in 1816. So in a way, this shows the pride and confidence in their version of French history, of the French royal family and other enemies of the revolution. Here is another memorial to victims of the revolution outside Angers, because many ordinary people were guillotined when Angers was recaptured by the Republicans. 1820, there is another Bourbon victim, the Duc de Berry, the nephew and distant heir of Louis XVIII, is stabbed to death as he's leaving the opera, 13th to 14th of February 1820. He has a long agony. He begs for the mercy of his murderer to the king, but the king refuses mercy. There is a ceremonial lying in state here in the Louvre. This is by Hippolyte Lecomte, and it's a major political event. Another royal death. It leads to the end of Louis XVIII's liberal experiment. His minister favorite, Comte de Cazes, has to resign. He loses the majority in the Chamber of Deputies, and it's the beginning of a turn to the right from 1820 to 1827, really. More and more conservative governments are installed, partly in reaction to this royal death. And you see the splendor of the royal court under the Bourbons with heralds' uniforms. And here is the ceremony in Saint-Denis with the catafalque of the prince, attended by all the political elite of France, and even, which was unprecedented, by the king himself, who is shown here in a box. I think the thinking was normally monarchs did not attend the funerals of anybody, even of the consort. I think the feeling was that, well, perhaps some of you can enlighten me, that royal majesty should not be close to death. But Louis XVIII attends the Duc de Berry's funeral, I think because political passions were so intense that if he hadn't, he would have been accused by ultra-royalists of having been complicit or rejoicing in it. Anyway, and there was a massive procession from Paris to Saint-Denis. And in fact, the crowd was large and quite respectful. It wasn't yet totally anti-Bourbon, but Napoleonic propaganda hadn't yet started to win all hearts. In fact, this royal death and funeral benefited the royalists. And this is a hospice by Fröhlicher, the Hospice St. Charles, where his widow, the Duchesse de Berry, buried the prince's heart. Again, the division of the body. This is outside the country house in Normandy, and the heart is still buried there, and with some of the prince's blood-stained clothes, whereas his entrails were sent to Lille, a city where he was particularly popular. And this is the lying in state of Louis XVIII in the Tuileries in 1824 by Chasselas, the last monarch to die on the throne of France. It's in the throne room, which has just been redecorated, again by Dugourc. And I'd like to quote some of the contemporary accounts of this lying in death. The Comte Anatole de Montesquieu, who attended, the crowds would file past, including members of the public, not just the elite, through the throne room, rather as recently in Westminster Hall. And Anatole de Montesquieu, who'd seen the court of Napoleon and had been loyal to Napoleon, he wrote of the lying in state of Louis XVIII, never for any event has there been such a crowd. And in fact, the palace had been surrounded by a silent crowd as the king died. And it was said that the silence of the crowd was such that inside the palace, you had no idea that it was just outside. And 40,000 Parisians went past in one day, according to contemporary newspapers. Adolphe Thiers, who was a liberal journalist, wrote, "The entire population of Paris has put on mourning. All week, the Tuileries was besieged to see the throne room." This is this room. So it's much more of a popular ceremony than the death of Louis XV or even Louis XIV. 23rd of September, a magnificent funeral cortege leaves the Tuileries and goes to Saint-Denis. There is artillery fire, all the bells of Paris were ringing, all the windows were filled and all the streets crowded as far as the Basilica. And all along the road to Saint-Denis, the route was lined with crowds. So contrary to the standard projection, the monarchy of Louis XVIII appears, at least outwardly, to have been more respected than the monarchy of Louis XIV, when everybody was dancing, drinking, and playing the violin as the procession went past. And the Grand Master of Ceremonies, who happens to be the Marquis de Dreux-Brézé, the same one who tried to get Mirabeau to leave at the beginning of the States General in 1789. He was congratulated on the magnificent funeral service. This is the departure of the procession with a hearse, which we'll be coming to later. There, excuse me, there it is, the hearse of Louis XVIII, which you can see in the stables at Versailles. And it was originally made for Maréchal Lannes, one of Napoleon's marshals. It's used for Louis XVIII, and then it's recycled by every subsequent regime. It's used for the son of Louis Philippe, for the uncle of Napoleon III, King Jerome, and then later for two presidents of the Third Republic, President Félix Faure and Sadi Carnot. So it is an example of the enduring ceremonious aspect of French power. And here is a ticket to the king's funeral, signed by the captain of the guards. You see, these were issued like tickets to other royal funerals. And here is the funeral itself in Saint-Denis, again with a catafalque. And here are some of the heralds' costumes used, commissioned for the funeral. And again, the restoration never really letting go of the royal deaths. Here is the laying of the foundation stone for a massive statue of Louis XVI, which, as if there weren't enough already in Paris and Saint-Denis, was going to be erected in the Place de la Concorde, on the exact spot where he'd been guillotined. And I think this was done at the insistence of his daughter, the Duchesse d'Angoulême, who still survived, and no government, however impolitic they thought it was, could resist her tears and her pressure. She was a really powerful political influence. And I would now like to end with some of the other funerals which marked the 19th century in France, and which again show the power of the different dynasties that ruled it. This is the funeral of Napoleon, painted by Guillot, another massive procession, 15th of December, 1840, organized by Louis Philippe, attended by the surviving members of Napoleon's household, and he thought he was capturing Napoleonic prestige for his regime, but in fact, he was probably reinforcing the Napoleonic legend and the Napoleonic dynasty, which would eventually replace his own on the throne of France. Here it is again by Eugène Lamy. Again, it was a day so cold, rather like the reburial of Louis XVI in 1815, so cold that some spectators died. And this is the funeral of the Duc d'Orléans, the eldest son of Louis Philippe, 1842, who died in a riding accident. The ceremony is being held in Notre Dame, and in fact he was buried in Dreux, the necropolis of the House of Orléans, that anybody interested in 19th century monarchy or sculpture should visit. It's the same hearse as was used for Louis XVIII, and again this is part of the biological misfortunes of French dynasties. This brilliant and popular and able eldest son and heir of Louis Philippe dies. Everybody at the time said this is a great misfortune for France, and it meant that Louis Philippe did not have him at his side in 1848. If Ferdinand Philippe, Duc d'Orléans, had survived, things might have been very different. This is the chapel built in his memory, and again I think it's the Orléans answer to the chapelle expiatoire of the Bourbons, some magnificent sculpture and stained glass windows inside. It's called Notre Dame de la Compassion. You can visit it near the Boulevard Périphérique now. This is the prince, and he's almost represented as in my opinion, as a dying Christ. The power of Christianity in 19th century France and the appropriation of sanctity by each successive dynasty. And here he is represented openly as Saint Ferdinand, a prince himself not renowned for his piety. And these stained glass windows are by Ingres. And this is Saint Amelia, i.e. his mother, Queen Marie-Amélie, and Saint Raphael, that is his brother, the Duc de Nemours, an extraordinary appropriation of Catholic imagery by a dynasty not renowned for its piety. And here is Louis Philippe himself represented as Saint Philippe. Louis Philippe, who was not who was a skeptic, nevertheless he is shown as a saint. And this is a model by Trichetti of the statue of the dying Duc d'Orléans. Trichetti was later, because the Orléans and Queen Victoria were friends and cousins, he was later used for the Albert Memorial Chapel, the effigy of Prince Albert in Windsor. There's another model. And this is the Prince Albert Cenotaph in St. George's Chapel, Windsor, by the same artist. So again, you see international royal mourning. I mean, even royal mourning, like much else in the 19th century, was European. And just to conclude with, this is the funeral of Louis Philippe in exile at Clermont, 1850. The funeral of Marie-Amélie, his widow at Clermont, again lying in state, more grandiose even than her husband's. Many foreign princes and ambassadors came to attend this funeral of this exiled queen. And there are Louis Philippe and Marie-Amélie in the sculptures in the necropolis at Dreux. And this is Ferdinand Philippe and his wife, Hélène. Because she's Protestant, she's buried in a side chapel away from the main Catholic church. And lastly, one of the last royal funerals of the French 19th century. This is the funeral of the Comte de Chambord, the exiled Bourbon pretender in Froschdorf in Austria. I wish I could have found a photograph of the occasion, because this really is the funeral of the French monarchy itself. After him, he had no children, another biological disaster. There were no serious royal pretenders. And here are the Bourbon tombs buried in Gorizia, which was the winter residence, and in an abbey church. So there's Charles X, his son, his daughter-in-law, Marie-Thérèse, the daughter of Louis XVI, and the Comte de Chambord, known to royalists as Henri V. And this was known to royalists as the Saint-Denis of exile. And that's the funeral of the last Orléans pretender, the Comte de Paris, at Weybridge in 1894. His corpse was later repatriated to Dreux. And this is the last of all these dynastic funerals. This is the Abbey Church built at Farnborough, southwest of London, by the widowed Empress Eugénie, which again is trying to be another Saint-Denis, a Saint-Denis for the Bonapartes in exile, where she is buried and Napoleon III is buried, and their son, the Prince Imperial, is also buried. And there is a new museum to the Empress Eugénie, has just been opened in the Palace of Compiègne, north of Paris, which has more illustrations of the funerals she organized for her husband and son. And it shows that in no way was her mourning or her public widowhood in any way less intense than that of her friend and host, Queen Victoria. On that note, I would like to end. I hope I've shown that the power of royal funerals, the political impact, particularly in the 19th century, and there's no diminution of them from the 17th century. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you so much. As always, so broad ranging, so it allows us to ask all kinds of questions of how things change over the century and a half that you looked at, or how do they stay the same. If you'd like to maybe stop sharing your screen, we can open it up a little bit more.
How do I do that?
I can't do it for you.
Maybe yes.
Here, I can do it.
Okay.
Oh, but now I've lost your picture.
Doesn't matter. Oh. Yeah.
There you go. Okay, great. So I have a couple questions, but I certainly will open it up to broader questions from the floor. We've got a number of people in the audience who I think are very interested in this topic. For me, I was drawn almost immediately to your comment about how if the heir to Louis Philippe had survived, maybe the monarchy could have had a different path, which is such an interesting kind of trope that you encounter all the time. If only James I and VI son had survived, or if only Louis XV's son had survived, you sort of do wonder, maybe these boys wouldn't have grown up to be so great after all. But yeah, that was my first thought.
Yes, I agree with you, but I think what people are trying to say is he would have done better than the Duc de Nemours, his younger brother, who's sort of in charge of the Tuileries and is fairly hopeless, as the other brothers were, like the Duc de Montpensier also, whereas Louis Philippe was just so old and tired, he just got out as soon as he could. Maybe Ferdinand Philippe, who was a professional soldier, would have made a stand, but whether that would have improved things isn't clear.
Yeah, well, anyway, that's all off topic. It's not really about funerals. So let's get to some hands up. I think Fabian was first.
Thank you. Absolutely fascinating, Philip. Really, really enjoyed this. And so many questions. I mean, two sort of quite... Oh, no.
So maybe his connection has dropped. I know he was having troubles with this a little bit earlier. Maybe we'll regroup and come back to Fabian later. Helen, do you want to maybe ask your question?
Okay. Yeah, that was fascinating, Philip, and absolutely wonderful images and suggestions for places that we should go to visit, which, yeah, I've got quite a long list now. But what I wanted to ask you was, you said loads about the ceremonial, but you didn't say anything about the actual religious ceremonies. And I just wondered, you know, some of these rulers had a somewhat fraught relationship with maybe, you know, the local bishop, with Rome, with, you know, so on and so forth. So did the religious ceremonies fluctuate from time to time? Were there tensions about them?
Yes, the word, how did you guess? The word tensions. In France in the 19th century, people are watching the sermon and watching how they're going to avoid being politically awkward, because everybody at some stage has been opposed to everybody else. And I think on the whole, the sermon, well, the sermon for Louis XVI's reburial was not liked, but the others were quite popular. In particular, there was another royal funeral, which I didn't have time to include, of the Prince de Condé in 1818, the leader of the counter-revolution. And there was a famous sermon by Monseigneur Frécinus, who says, to try and hide the fact that he'd been fighting France, he says, unhappiness was everywhere, but no, happiness was nowhere, but glory was everywhere, or something like that. And there were disputes in 1824 at the funeral of Louis XVIII between the Grand Aumônier de France and the Archbishop of Paris as to who had jurisdiction over the royal funeral in Saint-Denis. And even earlier under Louis XIV, there'd always been disputes in Saint-Denis because the monks of Saint-Denis wanted bigger tips and more rewards than they usually got. And for Louis Philippe's son, which is really perhaps the most political of all the funerals, it's a sort of way of reconnecting to the Catholic Church. And there was a grandiose Catholic service attended by the king, who is not really a Catholic. And everybody noted that. But it's, as you could see with the plan for a new statue of Louis XVI, the Bourbons are using the Catholic Church and vice versa to reassert their vision of the French monarchy.
Oh, there he is.
Okay, thank you. Fabian, do you want to give it another go if your internet's restored again? But your microphone is off.
Yes, I'm muted. And now I'm muted. Well, two things really connected. Absolutely fascinating, as I said. I've looked a bit at Sweden at the same time, and they are really keen on opening graves and showing off bodies and having a look at the bodies and discussing that, oh, he's been dead for 70 years, but he really looks quite fresh. In this memorialization, do they open graves, look at graves, display bodies? I mean, for example, our caskets at the Lit de Parade, are they open? And so on. So how close can...
Well, that's a very good question. I didn't know that in Sweden they open bodies. I hope you write an article about Swedish royal funerals. In 1793, they're trying to desecrate and humiliate royal bodies. 1824 and 1820, they're exposing them because they've been embalmed. And this is the French royal tradition. In fact, they're treating kings as saints, I think. I'm quite ignorant about Catholic ritual. And so that's why the body parts are separated, as the body parts of the exiled Stuarts were, contrary to English royal tradition, I believe. But as for the other dynasties, I don't think their bodies were exposed as much as the Bourbons in state. They had a much more ordinary burial. And of course, Napoleon's actual burial was on St. Helena.
I mean, just a practical point. When you put your begin to dig, when you are going to reassemble various corpses after the revolution, I mean, that must be quite a big practical challenge if they are sort of thrown, sort of open various coffins and thrown them in.
In my opinion, it's fantasy. They said in 1815 that they had identified the bodies of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, because with hundreds of people, it's simply not possible. But by their rings or something like that, it's simply not possible. The rings would probably been stolen. Chateaubriand was part of the committee, and he wrote he could recognize the Queen by her smile. Well, how can you a corpse smile? It's part of the cult of death and alarms and mourning, which really is part of 19th century France, as people have written books on La France des larmes, and it's just as strong in Republicans and revolutionaries. I didn't have time to mention the terrific liberal public political funerals of General Lamarque and General Foy in, I think, 1826 and 1827, which are great big demonstrations against the government of Charles X, and later the funeral of Louis Philippe against the funeral of Lafayette against Louis Philippe, and then another huge Republican funeral is that of Victor Hugo in the 1880s, and the Panthéon aux grands hommes, la France reconnaissante, and all that. It's a much bigger part of daily life, and mourning itself is a bigger part of daily life, I think, than before or after.
Okay, thank you very much. Kurt, you've got a question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, yeah, good. First, thank you, Philip, for a really excellent presentation. I enjoyed it very much. And of course, one reason I enjoyed it was because of the relationship between French and Spanish protocol. And I've got a comment to make regarding your question about the seclusion of French monarchs after the death of their predecessors. I've noticed in my research on Spanish royal funerals and mourning that precisely the same sort of pattern occurred. And I was very, very puzzled about this and tried to figure out what was happening the moment the monarch died. This was true in the 17th century and was very, very clearly true in the 18th. The moment the monarch died, his successor, and for most of the time, there was no question who that successor would be. So there was no interruption, actually, in the possession of the throne. His successor would go into seclusion. And that seclusion would last until after the funeral. All the ceremonies were over, at least at the court and capital. And I concluded that the reason in the sort of Hispano-Franco-Burgundian etiquette, the reason that was required was to avoid the problem of having two individuals both being recognized as the monarch, that is, with a kind of double ceremonial. And that really had to be avoided because, of course, there's only one monarch at any time. And so the living monarch goes into seclusion. There are no rituals. He's simply completely out of sight. It's as if he had ceased to exist. He has a totally private existence, in Spain at least, until his predecessor is buried. And I was wondering if you think that's a possibility, that perhaps the French monarchy shared that assumption.
I know that in an earlier period, when, I mean, all these ceremonies I've been showing were really very minor compared to the real French royal funeral, which was in the 16th century, and for Henri IV, when the king lay in state for longer and there was more institutional ceremonies. And the king, at one time, the king's dead body, food and drink was brought for it in the 16th century, I think. But the King of France doesn't actually go into seclusion after the death of his predecessor. He just leaves the palace and he doesn't attend the funeral. But the young Louis XV, for example, lived in public, or was in fact exhibited in public to the Parisians the moment his great-grandfather died. And Charles X in 1824, he moves to the Palace of Saint-Cloud, but he's immediately receiving the authorities, receiving ministers and so on. I think seclusion is possibly specifically Spanish or Austrian. I'm not certain.
Well, that could very well be, Philip. And that's interesting. It's the first I've understood of that difference between the two types of ceremony. And it's particularly interesting when in the 20th century there has been at least one royal funeral. I just point out quickly, there's been one royal funeral in Spain amongst the Bourbons, and that was the grandfather of the present king, who was given the same ceremonial as his predecessors. Although he was, of course, never king himself because of the Republican Revolution in 1931, but he was given the ceremonial and the burial, eventually in the Escorial, as if he had been monarch. And the interesting thing is that the court ceremonial in the 1990s, when he died and was buried, was very, very similar to the burial ceremonial of his predecessors, Philip IV, and the Spanish Habsburgs in the 17th century. It was almost precisely the same as had occurred then.
Yep.
So the continuity as well as difference, I suppose, both difference from one monarchy to another, although in theory they shared the same bones of etiquette, continuity and innovation combined, I think, typically always.
Yes, and thank you very much, Kurt. And I'm sure continuity is one of the motives for this grandiose reburial of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette.
Absolutely.
To show that the monarchy goes on, though they didn't have a burial for Louis XVII. Though I think there's some sort of tomb at Saint-Denis, but not mentioned in the grandiose reburial of his parents. But they had to show that the line had gone on. And there were, by the way, in exile, grandiose funeral services, memorial services for Louis XVI in emigration, and then a huge funeral service in 1810 in London for Louis XVIII's wife, who is actually buried briefly in Westminster Abbey. And it's a sort of England and the Allied powers showing respect to the Bourbons and suggesting that they are the candidate. And this Napoleon had police agents observing and was said to have been very angered by it.
That's interesting. Even though, of course, Louis XVIII didn't really get on with his wife by that point, certainly at all.
That doesn't stop you giving her a grand funeral. Oh.
No, that's right. The ceremony must go on, personal feelings aside. I think we've got time for a couple more questions. Adam Storing has his hand up.
Hello, Philip. Thank you so much for such an interesting presentation.
Thank you.
I was interested by what you, what you were saying also about earlier French royal funerals. I was wondering, I mean, could you, Louis XIV is somebody who changes and develops a French royal ceremonial, you know, in many ways. It's a new look to the court in many ways. I mean, what does Louis XIV do? How does he shape French royal funerals? Does he put his own imprint on it, or is it something that is this a piece of continuity that just goes straight through his reign and straight on out the other side?
I think it's basically continuity, and probably the king, I mean, I don't think the king planned his own funeral as Elizabeth II did, for example, but there were many grandiose royal funerals in his reign, his wife and the Prince de Condé and others, and I don't think they changed much, but there would have been more people attending, more guards and different guards escorting, and more people forced to attend at Saint-Denis when they didn't really want to spend I should have said, these were very, very long services with a lot of mass and vespers and singing and prayers and sermons. So the ladies of there is an account of the funeral of Marie-Thérèse, and the ladies of the court really didn't want to spend so long there, but they had to on the king's orders. And what other changes does he do? I think it's just general aggrandizement, but nothing spectacular, in my opinion. Probably a more visual elements as the menu plaisir become better organized, and they have more tapestries to display and more mourning clothes to display. And as Joris Sternberg has shown, these mourning cloaks, the length of your mourning cloak at a royal funeral is a tremendous way of sort of trying to edge up in the royal hierarchy, or for the Condé to try and equalize with the Orléans or vice versa. So always they're not just political, but also the ceremonial battlefields, as you well know, and who is the chief mourner, who is around the Queen's coffin, and so on. But I don't think he's a radical innovator in ceremonial, just making it bigger and better.
Thank you. And I think a last question. We've got Nigel Israel.
Yeah, I was just reminded about a monarch staying out of the way, but Queen Elizabeth I, when she entered London, she took up residence in the Charterhouse, held her first Privy Council there, and stayed there, I think, till after Mary's funeral, so that she wouldn't be involved with it. So I'm not sure about later monarchs, but that did seem the idea of staying out of the way till your predecessor was finally finished with, if you can put it that way.
Yes, well, I think that's something very fundamental to European monarchy, the idea that the monarch shouldn't be in the presence of death. But why the monarch shouldn't be in the presence of death, what the fundamental reason is, I'm not certain, because they're going to every other sort of church service.
Was it, because it is actually still, is it still, I think, in this country, treason to actually talk about the death of the monarch?
I didn't know that.
No, I think it still is, actually.
Yeah, well, probably a lot of people are committing treason.
That's kind of interesting. Yeah, I think to round off and get us back onto this topic of what is now actually quite topical, really, of royal funerals. We're certainly looking at all of the assembled foreign royals who were at the service a few weeks ago,
Yes.
and if we are asking whether two kings can exist in the same space at once, we certainly saw two Spanish kings sitting side by side almost, or a Dutch king and a Dutch queen. So, you know, times have changed.
Yeah, yeah. But I think the sort of public reaction to these royal funerals, and indeed recently in England, shows that in some ways royal funerals go further even than royal weddings or even coronations.
Yes, that would be interesting to see whether there's a study to see how popularity changed, how people, because I certainly notice as a foreigner that I see attraction to the British royal family always goes up after any kind of ceremony, whether it's a marriage or a coronation or a few. Well, I haven't seen a coronation, obviously. So in a year's time, let's all meet again, I suppose, and discuss coronations, whenever that's going to be happening, and that'll be something topical. But for tonight, I think we should all just kind of raise a virtual glass to Philip Mansell for once again giving us really, really good food for thought. Thank you very much, Philip. And
thank you.
I just got a glass. Okay, good.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Sure.